Turning to today's panel, I am extremely pleased to introduce the newest member of the Middle East Institute team, Ambassador Gerald Feierstein. Jerry has joined MEI to lead MEI's new Center for Gulf Affairs. This is a new initiative to deepen and diversify our writing and programming about the GCC countries, Iraq, Iran, and Yemen, sort of Gulf countries broadly conceived. In virtually his first duty since joining yesterday, he has kindly agreed to jump in and moderate today's panel. Many here know Jerry as a senior U.S. diplomat for 4 decades. He retired from government this past spring with the personal rank of career minister, the State Department's equivalent of a 4-star general. His last service was as Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Near East Affairs. He served from 2010 to 2013 as U.S. Ambassador to Yemen. Prior to that, he excelled through numerous postings in South Asia and the Middle East as a policy and program innovator, as well in counterterrorism and combating violent extremism. We're very pleased that he's bringing this wealth of experience and expertise to the Middle East Institute and to audiences such as yourself. Thank you again for joining us today, and please join me in welcoming Jerry, who will introduce our topic and our panelists. Thank you, Jerry.
Thank you very much, Paul. And on a personal note, I will say that I'm delighted to have this opportunity to be a part of the MEI team, and certainly all through my career in the Foreign Service, the Middle East Institute was always outstanding in its reputation for providing expert and highly valued advice and analysis to people here in Washington. And so the opportunity to join is a great one. Like many of you in the audience today, I think that Gulf issues, U.S. relationships in the region are going to be very high on the list of priorities for the new administration, as they have been for this current administration. And the goal that I hope that we'll be able to achieve at the Middle East Institute is to be a part of the conversation that is going to be had here in Washington and around the country over what is going to happen in the region, how the U.S. can support our friends and partners as they work through their own very challenging issues, and how we as the United States can deepen and broaden the relationships that we have there. I can't think of a more appropriate way to launch that conversation and to take count and take the temperature a little bit of what's happening in the region than we are going to have today in the discussion about Saudi Vision 2030. The sweeping changes that have been proposed in this plan will not only drive social, political, and economic change in the kingdom for many decades to come, but they will also profoundly affect Saudi engagement with the United States and indeed with the world. So I'm delighted that we have an outstanding panel of experts that are going to enlighten us today and to delve into this vision thing as we know it. As Paul mentioned, each of the speakers have been asked to provide some opening remarks for about 6 to 8 minutes precisely. And then hopefully we will be able to have a short engagement after that and leave lots of time for all of you to ask your questions and to engage. So I'm not going to provide long introductions for the speakers. I think that you've all picked up outside on the table the bio sheet. But let me invite Fahad Nazar to kick off the conversation. Fahad is coming to us today from the Arab Gulf Studies Institute. where he focuses on Saudi political, social, and economic developments. So Fahad, one of the critical challenges, I think, if you can give us a bit of context, a bit of overview of how the Saudi Vision 2030 program came together, and also share with us your insights on how it's playing with the Saudi people and how the government is going to get buy-in from its population.
All right. Thank you very much, Ambassador, and thanks to the Middle East Institute for inviting me. It's a real honor to be among such a distinguished company here today. So I would like to set the stage by citing a few key figures that I think will provide some context to how we've arrived at this stage and why we have a Vision 2030 in the first place. So as most of you know, oil remains to be a very important part of the Saudi economy. It accounts for approximately 40% of the GDP, 90% of export earnings, and about 80% of government revenues. As all of you know, I'm sure, oil is a global commodity. It's traded across the world. It's a fickle commodity to some extent, for sure. The price has fluctuated over the years. As recently as 2014, it was over $100 a barrel. It is in the $50 range now, and it was in the 20s earlier in this year as well. We tend to think of, there was a period of high oil prices, and maybe some of us began to think of $100 a barrel as the norm, but that is certainly has not been the norm for much of the history of the past few decades. In fact, we tend to forget at this point that for decades, or certainly an entire decade, the OPEC price band was between $20 and $30 a barrel. That was a good enough price for then. However, everything, I think, has changed over the past couple of years, largely due to the revolution in technology here in the United States in shale oil and gas. It has led to a glut of supply that the oil producers have had trouble grappling with. We obviously all know that the oil producers have tried to regulate the market to a certain extent over the years in the form of this consortium or cartel called OPEC. Its effectiveness has varied over the years, and I think the consensus at this point is that it does not have too much control over the price of oil. I think Saudi Arabia, I think, has come to the realization that that is the case. Oil is a difficult global commodity, and its price will, for the foreseeable future, become harder to control, not easier. In addition, I think from the Saudi perspective, they've always, or certainly long, realized that oil is not a labor-intensive sector, and it's becoming less so as the technology advances. This is a problem for Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia's population has quadrupled since 1970, when it was 5 million. It is over 22 million today, with an added 8 million or so expats. There's an estimated 200 to 300,000 Saudis who enter the job market every year. I think by all accounts, the oil sector is just not equipped to deal with such a large number. Over the years, the model that has sustained Saudi Arabia, the Saudi state, until today, has focused on the public sector, on the government. The government remains to be the employer of choice for most Saudis. By most estimates, 7 out of 10 Saudis still work for the government. And obviously, oil has been, I don't want to paint a very grim picture that oil has been nothing but a curse. That's clearly not entirely the case. It's been a blessing in many ways. It has enabled Saudi Arabia to build a fairly modern infrastructure, and to build that. Saudi Arabia has the trappings, most of the trappings of a modern economy, with modern highways, airports, schools, healthcare systems, and this transformation has happened very quickly. According to many, it was a transformation that has not been seen in modern times. But like I said, I think much of this changed in 2014 as oil prices began a steep decline. And last year, in fact, the Saudi government posted its biggest budget deficit ever. It was in excess of $100 billion. So as this was happening, as these structural changes were taking place in the global energy sector, in this global energy market, there was a change in political leadership in Saudi Arabia. King Abdullah passed away in early 2015, and his brother and Crown Prince, King Salman, took over, and he began to forge his own legacy almost immediately. One of the first things he did was change the order of succession. He appointed two relatively young princes as Crown Prince, Prince Mohammed bin Naif, who is the long-serving interior minister, and an even younger prince, Mohammed bin Salman, who is in his early 30s. He appointed him as as deputy crown prince, and he put him in charge of a newly created council called the Development and Economic Council. So by all accounts, it is Prince Mohammed bin Salman who is who's the person behind this vision. It is he has taken it upon himself to sell it to the Saudi population at large, but he's also certainly also tried to sell it to foreign investors abroad. Now, just out of curiosity, how many here have actually read the Vision 2030, which is widely available online? Okay, that's a good number. I highly recommend reading it. I think it's a very easily accessible. It is available online, and it's meant to be, clearly, I think it's written very carefully, and it's meant to be easily accessible for the non-expert person or audience. To put it simply, I mean, if I could explain what the Vision 2030 is in 3 words or less, I would call it a restructured social contract, to use the language of sports and business. We hear a lot about restructuring of contracts. I think that while much of the attention on the vision and has been on this, the central component of it, which is a very ambitious package of economic reforms that are clearly aimed at reducing Saudi Arabia's dependence on oil earnings and by diversifying the economy. I think it goes beyond that. Like I said, I think that the way I've read it, and others have as well, is this is a restructured social contract that in many ways is asking Saudi citizens to redefine how they see their role in Saudi society. And it also, in some ways, redefines the responsibility of the Saudi state. In many instances, the vision calls and makes it very explicit that for it to succeed, for the future stability and prosperity of Saudi Arabia, every individual citizen has to play a role. And really, I think that is really the central theme of the vision, is that the government, the state, no longer wants to be the driver of the economy, that this has to be a collective effort, everyone has to play a part. The word partnership, I think, appears in the vision at least a dozen times. We're talking about partnerships domestically with the private sector, with the nonprofit sector, but also with the international partners as well. What's interesting, I think if you read the vision, you get a sense that it becomes very clear that Prince Mohammed bin Salman is indeed the person that most people associate with it, because there's a certain candor to the language that you get from one of the interviews that he's given. Again, in addition to recommending that you read the vision, I also highly recommend watching a very lengthy interview that Prince Mohammed bin Salman gave to Al Arabiya about a year ago, where he spoke for almost an entire hour about exactly what he means by this vision, what he has in mind. And what struck me is, I think more than anything else, is just the candor with which he spoke. He, and as well as this vision itself, readily admit that there will be challenges ahead, that there have been problems, that some projects in the past have not worked. One of these projects that are actually emphasized in the vision is the economic and industrial cities. Some of them are actually mentioned by name. And they're basically presented now as opportunities for the future. And I think this is the key here, that while there's acknowledgement that there are serious challenges ahead and sacrifices will be made, everything is framed as an opportunity and for either the private sector, for enterprising Saudis, or for foreign investors as well. So just to some of the keywords that are repeated over and over in the vision are transparency, accountability, partnership, which I've already mentioned, efficiency, agility, improve, and a big theme is improving the quality of life of Saudis and to expats. Again, this shows, and again, even a cursory reading of the vision shows that this goes way beyond just economic reforms. At the heart of it, it is trying to improve the lives of average Saudis, as well as people in expats in Saudi Arabia. It is trying to attract the best and the brightest from abroad, but it's also clearly aimed at keeping Saudi talent inside Saudi Arabia. So some of the major goals here, I'll go through some of them very quickly. One is to increase private sector contribution to GDP from 40% to 65%, to raise Saudi Arabia's ranking on the Global Competitiveness Index from the current 25 to top 10, increase foreign direct investment from 3.8% of GDP to the international average of 5.7%, increase the assets of the Public Investment Fund from the current $160 billion to $2 trillion, increase localization of oil and gas sectors from 40% to 75%. And it goes on and on. These are very ambitious goals. Some are actually set for 2020. Others are for 2030. There's a more detailed plan of implementation known as the National Transformation Program, and that's where you kind of get into the nitty-gritty of the details in terms of year to year and what the various departments have, what the goals are, what the benchmarks are, and how to go about achieving them. So I think this is very ambitious. There are major challenges up ahead, but I'm sure we will look at some of the details going forward here in the rest of the discussion. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Fahad. Next, we have Dr. Jean-Francois Cesnak, who has a great deal of experience over the years in banking and finance globally, but specifically, of course, in the region. And Dr. Cesnak is going to share with us his thoughts on where we are on one of the key components of this Vision 2030, which is the privatization of Saudi Aramco, but also the development of the Saudi Sovereign Investment Fund and downstream industries. So, Dr. Cesnak?
All that in 8 minutes. So
in 8 minutes.
We'll try to do what we can. It's very interesting what Fahad just mentioned. I think one of the way to present this, which in my own head I've presented this to myself, is that the whole Vision 2030 is really a way to change the whole view of the state. Until now, the people were taken care of by the state, but from now on, the people will have to take care of the state. And that is quite a transformation in society. So one of the key factors of this was the implementation of the privatization of Saudi Aramco. Why? Because not so much to raise money. Yes, they probably will raise a small, meager $100 billion on the market. But I think the key issue here is to really promote transparency, because Saudi Aramco is a very, very good company. It's probably one of the best oil companies in the world, and certainly the best national oil company in the world. But we don't really know, one, who owns Saudi Aramco and how the money goes and how much is taken out of the top by the royal family and whatnot. So I think this will change, and this is very much a way for this vision, for the prince and so on, to really control how the royal family controls the flow of funds, and to force the people to read, or to push the people in demanding transparency in all aspects of the economy. So really, how it's going to be done, there's been a mention that they will be floating 5% of the shares. Well, they have hired JP Morgan Chase and Klein and Company to value the company. That's the first step. You have to value what there is. One major factor I have to insist on is that unlike ExxonMobil, who owns its reserves, or Chevron, who owns its reserves. Saudi Aramco does not own the reserves of Saudi Arabia. Saudi Aramco is appointed by the state to run the reserves. So the value of Saudi Aramco is not in the oil in the ground. The value of Saudi Aramco is really in the value of those leases. And how they will be valued, we don't know. We don't know, honestly, we don't know whether there are leases already. We don't know where they probably are. We don't know whether it'll be for 20 years, 50 years, 100 years. We don't know that. JP Morgan is probably working on this very actively right now. They also, of course, are an operating company. They have hundreds of rigs. They drill themselves. They buy a lot of technology from people all over the world. It's really, as I mentioned before, a top-notch company. They have very large investments in refineries. And Saudi Aramco today, worldwide, has a capacity of over 5.5 million barrels, which is one of the largest refining system in the world. And they will increase this very shortly to about 6 million barrels a day. So that has an enormous amount of value. We'll see how that is. I mean, a rule of thumb, in my view, is that if I just take the cash flow of Saudi Aramco, which of course we don't know, but if I estimate the cash flow of Saudi Aramco this year to be $100 million after expenses for Saudi Aramco and other expenses, and I would say their cash flow is $100 billion, which means that at a multiple of 20, which is a pretty standard multiple in oil, that would give them a value of $2 trillion, which is really a back-of-the-envelope thing. It's much more complex than that. But at $2 trillion, that means 5% is $100 billion. That's where the $100 billion comes from, at least for me. So how it's going to take place? I mean, there are many possibilities on how these shares will be distributed. I think I will propose what I think is going to happen because it's the simplest way. I think the Saudi Aramco as a company will be transferred basically to the Public Investment Fund, and the Public Investment Fund in turn will sell 5% of the shares to the public and raise the money which will go to the Public Investment Fund to fund the Public Investment Fund and whatever else. The state will probably not suffer too much from selling Saudi Aramco or not having any longer the direct control of Saudi Aramco, but go through this wealth fund, this sovereign fund. And I would imagine that all of a sudden Saudi Aramco will have officially taxes. Everybody will tell you at Saudi Aramco that they pay taxes and so on to the state, but there's no such thing as income tax in Saudi Arabia. So now all of a sudden, there will be an income tax and an official income tax, which of course a lot of people might dislike in Saudi Arabia because it's a very bad precedent. You know, mentioning taxes in Saudi Arabia is like putting holy water on the devil, you know. I mean, it's really dangerous. So, but that's probably what's going to happen. They also will pay royalties probably for that lease, or those leases I was talking about. So in any event, the funding of the state will not change very much. But we will know when the letters of credits under oil are paid, basically always to JP Morgan. We will know how much money then will stay at Saudi Aramco, how much money will go to the state and to other third parties that are not too well known at this point. That will be defined, because one of the key issues, and that's where the transparency comes in, is that if you start floating shares in Riyadh and in London, as probably will be the case in my view, you have to publish audited statements. And every large Saudi company that is traded on the stock exchange in Riyadh publishes audited statements by international auditors or local auditors, but it's always very good and very precise. Saudi Aramco will have to do the same thing, so we'll know exactly how the money flows. And that is really key to the privatization, because then people will know that the way business was done in the past is no longer the case. And we'll see how that really evolves. So we mentioned that the money will probably, or the shares of the company may end up being owned by Public Investment Fund. Why am I saying that? The Public Investment Fund, where PIF was presented to the press as being basically a sovereign wealth fund. It's not a sovereign wealth fund, it's a sovereign fund, basically. I mean, the policies of the fund until now was totally controlled by the Ministry of Finance. All the employees were really Ministry of Finance employees. That has changed. Physically, apparently, the PIF has now moved away from the Ministry of Finance, is now in its own separate building, and the chair of the PIF is now Mohammed bin Salman. And that makes a big difference instead of being the Minister of Finance. So that means the PIF will be much more independent. They will become more sovereign wealth fund in the normal sense, in the sense that they are going to take, and they are taking already, investments outside the country. Most of their investment, in my view, will probably be within the country, but they will invest outside the country. They have already invested in Uber, for instance. Why? Because they like the technology and they always feel that the technology can be used in Saudi Arabia. They have a couple other investments. They've just signed an agreement in principle. I think it's just a head of understanding, a head of agreement with SoftBank of Japan to start a $100 billion venture capital fund, which will be based in London. So they will get involved very much. Now, PIF is not nothing. PIF doesn't come out of the blue. It was started in 1972 by King Faisal at the time in order to help Saudi companies to go to the public so that the public would buy shares to get familiar with the industrial development of the kingdom. And their first big operation was to become the shareholders of a company that did not exist at the time called SABIC, Saudi Arabian Basic Industries Corporation, which today is the second largest chemical company in the world after BASF. So they have been very, very successful at that. 30% of those shares are already in the public. So PIF was really pushing to develop the country for a long, long time. But they had never done anything outside the country, and certainly nothing of that size. So we'll see how that develops. But so the Public Investment Fund is already the largest shareholder of SABIC. It's the largest shareholder of Ma'aden, which is a mining company. As a mining company, it does phosphates, and they today have a very large phosphate industry in the kingdom. They have a large aluminum plant in the kingdom in joint venture with Alcoa, one of the largest in the world, and they are going to really continue to do this more and more, I would say. But they might float a lot of those, they might float some of those shares out. I mean, maybe SABIC will be divided in various divisions because they're doing so many different things. I don't know, but PIF could push this one way or the other, and as a holding company for the whole economy of the kingdom could reverse how things have developed until now. Just a final word on the private sector. The private sector has been involved already. I mean, this Vision 2030 doesn't come out of nothing. Yes, it is the vision of Mohammed bin Salman, but it's also the vision of a number of very high-ranking civil servants in Saudi Arabia, either the Minister of Oil, who is a brilliant man who has had all these ideas for years, and the Minister of Planning, who is also extremely brilliant and has pushed this forever, and they've sort of gelled with a young prince to push these ideas. Now, the private sector has existed. There are many private companies traded in chemicals, downstream from chemicals and mining in the kingdom. Many of them most of them are traded on the stock exchange. And just a little factoid to tell you that this is not coming out of nothing. The sales of these companies on the stock market of the chemical and mining companies on the stock exchange in Riyadh, if you total them up, they correspond to about 55, 57% of the sales of Saudi Aramco. So, of course, the state gets nothing out of it because the state is not a shareholder and there are no income tax. So I foresee, you know, I'm so smart, I'm foreseeing there will be income tax on corporations because that's the only way the state will be able to fund itself. So I think we will see a lot of changes. It's a very difficult situation. A lot of established orders within the royal family, within the religious establishment and so on are very opposed to changing the way things were going in the past. But to change from being the state, the people depending on the state, to the state depending on the people is really a revolution in many ways. So I will leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jean-Francois. Next, we're going to turn to Hala Dasari, who is at the Arab Gulf Institute this year as a visiting fellow, also a well-known women's rights advocate in Saudi Arabia. And we'll ask Hala to talk again a little bit about the social aspects of the Saudi Vision 2030 project.
Thank you, Ambassador, and thank you for coming here. So just to tap on the previous speakers, I would like to take the National Transformation Program 2020, which is in a way a translation of what it means to have Vision 2030 in reality for the ministerial work. So various ministerial task forces were developed, and they came up with their own key performance indicators in order to reduce spending, restructure their ministries, and provide targeted area for improvement. And the goal was to identify whatever challenges that is and to develop initiatives to address them, all while maintaining the transparency and practicing continuous auditing. And these turned out to be the main challenges of the National Transformation Program or the Vision 2030. So the funding of the initiatives, not all of the initiatives were funded, but it is forecasted to be funded by restructuring spending. So this is one thing that the method of doing that is very much not transparent. Which initiatives gets to be funded, why those initiatives in particular, would initiatives address the structural barriers that existed in the first place that created the challenge. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the whole program, National Transformation Program 2020, which by reading it, it's on the website of the Vision 2030. By reading it, you get a sense, a diagnostic sense of what kind of challenges faces different ministries in Saudi Arabia, but it is not a differential diagnosis. So though they recognize that there are certain problems, they're not really addressing the root causes of those problems. Maybe because they're just forecasting for the next 4 years or so. So the challenges and initiatives remains largely questionable, not only in the practicality, because if you're trying to solve a problem without addressing the main cause of it, it's not as practical to eradicate the problem or the scope of it. And the first problem that all ministries will face is the changing demographics. So Saudi Arabia is a highly growing country. We have a high population growth rate, a high lifespan of citizens increasingly, high birth rate, low death rate, high migration, and almost 60% of Saudi population are below 15 years of age. We have 6 million young Saudi who will enter at one point the workforce in the next 15 years. Half of them, 49% of the Saudi youth, are women. If we look at the different ministries, I will focus only on the Ministry of Health and Education, and would look at some of the initiatives identified to target health, for instance. So while the Ministry of Health has addressed the challenges of funding, of training the health workforce, of the timeliness of the service, of the access and the adequacy of the preventive care and the quality and outcome of care, they have set very minimal targets. For instance, the road traffic accidents, which really one of the growing concerns for the public health sectors. We are one of the countries where we have 27 deaths per 100,000 residents, compared to the international rate of 2. And to address that, they did a program called Sahir before that, where there is a financial penalty, basically to target people who are violating the speed or violating the traffic law. But it was never enforced. So there is no checkpoints enough to, for instance, to enforce these kinds of law. It's only monetary basis. And the death rate was never, and the program itself was never evaluated, and the death rate was never reduced. So they did not really address that problem, how grave this problem is, but they didn't address it, because this problem requires multi-sectoral approach. And one of the main, I think, challenges of transforming the vision is how to make those different ministries work together. And this was not reflected in the National Transformation Program. Obesity is one of the main challenges that is embedded in the cultural practices and tradition. How the Ministry of Education resisted to implement physical education, how tracks for walking and safe walking, for instance, practices for residents, women, children, are lacking in many residential areas. Most of the population are living in urban areas in Saudi Arabia, and those are not necessarily equipped with places for people to exercise or to have access to nutritional, basically advice or good health practices. Not in the schools, not in the public spaces. These issues were not addressed. There is a mere 1% reduction forecasted in 4 years in obesity rate. So this is very minimal, and it really does not address the huge burden that obesity will impose on the health services and on the productivity of nation at a whole. You will need a productive nation in order to counter all those economic restrictions and the austerity that is expected. And the Ministry of Education as well has identified several issues without looking at the infrastructure. For instance, many of the issues that are identified related to how to train teachers, how to reform curricula. There is an ongoing program called FATN for several years, and this program has been trying to infuse ideas of leadership, ideas of basically national pride into children. But it shows now that we have only 5% of students engaged in extracurricular activities, in clubs and activities outside the schools. And there is not much expected to increase those numbers because of the lack of coordination with different ministers. For instance, the Minister of Information or the Cultural Affairs. So again, this remains a challenge, how to engage more students in extracurricular activities and how to basically diversify their sources of learning and to reduce the burden on the public schools. Most of the private schools depend on private funding from the government as well. So how to create a thriving private education within foreseeable time, basically without having to put a lot of burden on the government. Transportation remains a problem for access to different levels of education, particularly for women. I think all of you know about the driving ban. I'm not going to go into depth for that. But only 28% of students in Saudi public schools use school transportation system, basically because we do not have this type of public transportation. And this has never been addressed as well in the public transportation, in the National Transformation Plan. Employment, for instance, is very low, particularly for women. Only 23% of women are part of the labor force. It is forecasted to increase to 28% only in 5 years. The focus of the National Transformation Program is to provide more job opportunities from home or teleworking for women, and instead of solving the main problem of transportation, safe working environment, legislation, and the work that would improve the access of women, like removing the requirement for obtaining a guardianship permission, or for training, travel for training, or travel for obtaining more education. And Prince Mohammed bin Salman did talk about that in his interview, where he talked about women as the untapped potential. But again, he blamed women and not basically the regulation and the regulatory system and the environment of work for the lack of participation. So regulation legislation was much lacking from the National Transformation Program, whether in creating more attractive environment or safe environment for people to engage in public space and to have more activities basically towards productivity, towards independence. I'm just gonna talk about one thing in 1 minute, which is the focus so much on, most of the ministries had certain focus on competitiveness, on basically trying to show their work as competitive compared to other countries, rather than to focus on the cultural and the specific barriers that exist in the local context. And this in itself is a problematic because we're not trying to impress. And this, I think, comes because most of them are now held accountable to the upper level of administration rather than feeling as partners, feeling as accountable themselves for their stakeholders. So I'm going to stop at that.
Thank you very much, Hala. And we will finish our panel discussion with Anthony Cordesman, who I think most of you are familiar with from his long work here in Washington in a number of different capacities. And Dr. Cordesman is going to talk to us about what is always the most important question, which is, what does this mean for us? And particularly in terms of our longstanding defense and security cooperation with Saudi Arabia.
I think it is also what is in it for Saudi Arabia. And we face, as a first challenge, the fact that our security relations with the kingdom have steadily deteriorated over the last few years, not at the military level, but certainly at the political level and the strategic level. The issues involved include Syria, Yemen, what's happening in Iraq, the Iranian nuclear agreement. There's doubt on both sides as to what the future of this relationship is, how to structure it, how much trust either side can put in the other. But the key issue is also how important is the stability of Saudi Arabia to the United States? And this is where I think Vision 2030 becomes critical. Part of the problem is I think we have lost touch with why our relationship has been so important. Part of it is the idea we have somehow moved toward some form of energy independence. That's fine as long as you never look at any of the numbers involved. The fact is that net imports for the U.S. now, as of an EIA report of last month, are about 4.7 million barrels a day. That puts Saudi Arabia, all oil imports from any source, at something less than 5% of total U.S. imports, which implies we aren't particularly dependent. The problem is we are absolutely dependent on that oil flowing to critical Asian states. If we look only at major Asian exporters, 27% of our imports are dependent on the steady, secure flow of oil to 4 Asian major trading partners. If you raise the ante to include all trading partners, it gets closer to 40%. It doesn't matter how much energy we produce domestically. In an interdependent economy, we are going to remain dependent on the stable flow of Gulf oil indefinitely into the future. The other issue is security, and here we have problems because of the war in Yemen, but we also have problems because of JASTA. I have no idea why the White House never mentioned that the FBI had done a thorough investigation of this some 10 years after the 28 pages. The State Department did raise it earlier on, but I can find no justification whatsoever other than political opportunism for the congressional vote on this issue. What I can find is that we are very much dependent on Saudi Arabia for cooperation in counterterrorism. And we have said so since 2004 in all of our annual reports on terrorism by the U.S. State Department. What I think is equally critical is that Saudi Arabia is a major partner in dealing with the other threats in the Gulf. Whatever may have happened as a result of the nuclear agreement, 3 of those threats are steadily getting worse. One is a steady buildup of the Iranian missile threat, which is now coupled to the beginning of the deployment of precision-guided conventional systems. Another is the buildup of an asymmetric threat to shipping traffic in the Gulf. A third is the expansion of Iranian influence in Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and possibly Yemen. And I think we have seen very little indication that the Supreme Leader and the Revolutionary Guards are becoming more friendly. This is not only, however, a matter of that threat. It is a matter of the overall stability of this region and the ability for the U.S. to take advantage of bases in the region, Saudi facilities, to have the kind of cooperation with the Gulf Cooperation Council we need. And that brings me to what I think is a critical problem in Vision 2030. I've read a number of the studies that went into it, some of which have not been circulated publicly. Almost all of them ignored the military dimension unless they focused only on the military dimension. That would be a little like running a model of the United States federal budget without paying any attention to the cost of the Defense Department and counterterrorism and homeland defense. So let me put this in perspective. How important is it? There is no meaningful public figure for Saudi security spending. The International Institute for Strategic Studies, which gets its data in part from the United States and British intelligence, puts Saudi expenditure at $81.9 billion on security in 2015. There are estimates which are considerably lower, but they seem to ignore the cost of the Yemen war and the cost of arms, which makes them essentially useless. What is that number? It's the third largest national security spending in the world. We spend about $600 billion. China spends about $146 billion. Russia only spent about $66 billion. The UK spent $56, and India spent $48 billion. How important is that burden on the Saudi economy? Well, the IISS puts it at 12.6%. The Stockholm Institute for Peace Research puts it at 13.5%. That might have been sustainable at $100 or more a barrel. It is not sustainable today, and it is certainly not compatible with the 2030 report, which does not take account of any of this expenditure. There has to be some adjustments in Saudi national security spending. You have to readjust the 2030 plan to take account of military costs. We need to seriously think how we deploy forces with Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf states in ways which provide the best form of deterrent in an affordable form, not simply posture. And let me just note, I don't know where President Obama got his very strange view of burden sharing, but that's 12.6% of the Saudi GDP compared to 3.6% of the US GDP, which means in terms of burden sharing, guess what? We're spending about a quarter of the burden of our economy on every aspect of national security that Saudi Arabia does. There are ways the efficiency of this could be greatly improved, but let me be blunt. The Gulf Cooperation Council has not made any meaningful institutional improvements in defense cooperation for more than a decade. King Abdullah tried. I know the Secretary General has tried. But the internal divisions in the Gulf have largely blocked that, and that has created a tremendous amount of waste, lack of interoperability, and inefficiency at every level. And it is time for people in the Gulf to address those issues frankly and not simply have an annual statement of success at the ministerial. Now let me close with what I think is a fundamental flaw in the 2030 plan, and one of the cases where you know it is going to fail. It's going to fail because everyone else who has tried this approach has failed as well. And that failure lies in the idea that you are going to create a military industries complex that'll be 100% owned by the government, but listed on the Saudi stock market. Exactly how that's going to work is only one of the problems. It is supposed to suddenly be so large it can supply 50% of the arms flow to Saudi Arabia. It's unclear whether that's in 2020 or 2030. Right now, the kingdom produces about 2% of its arms. It doesn't make any sense economically to do that, even if one ignores the functions. But here's the reality. There is no worse investment a developing country can make than investing in the production of advanced arms. You have no technology base. All you can do essentially is co-produce and assemble other people's weapons. I've audited this in 3 other countries. I won't get into the names. In each of them, it was a dismal failure because it made no economic sense from the start. It costs you much more to assemble other people's parts and modify them than it does to buy them directly and assembled. It is a marvelous opportunity for corruption and waste, both on the part of the company supplying it and on the part of those performing it. It does not train anyone in useful ways because essentially you are simply repeating other people's technology and manufacturing process. Now, I've said this to the Saudis, I will say it here publicly. I have no idea on earth how anybody could have justified this as a consultant. I would love to see anyone who believes it will work and advise the Saudis to do this, to make public any aspect of what this is. It doesn't mean there isn't an opportunity, but the opportunity lies in servicing equipment. It lies in simple modifications. It lies in focusing on the kind of arms that are cost-effective to produce, and where a business plan and detailed audits indicate you have a profit. And I would hope at a minimum that if the kingdom is going to do this at all, it creates the contract from hell in terms of the defense manufacturer. The moment there is a single default, it makes it globally public and goes for the CEO of the defense company that agrees to support it, because the whole history of not doing it is that somehow large amounts of money disappear. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kortesman. Let me, if I may, throw out the first question, a very general question for our panelists, and that is, as several of you have noted, this is as much a rewriting of the social contract as you described it, of a major shift in the political and social fabric of the country. If you look at, to use the analysis of Karen Elliott House in her book a few years ago, the 4 challenges that Saudi Arabia confronts in coming years, all of which will touch on the success or failure of Saudi Vision 2030. And that is, 1, as you noted, Fahad, 70% of Saudis working today work in the public sector. That's presumably 70% of males. How do you motivate young men to give up what has been a rather comfortable sinecure in their father's generation and their grandfather's generation, and go into the private sector and compete and be willing to put in the kind of effort that would be necessary in order to achieve success in the private sector that is not a factor in public sector work. Second, the role of women. And Hala touched on that a little bit in her comments. The reality not only that 49 or 50% of the young people are of course female, but if you look at higher education in Saudi Arabia today, in fact it is young women who are competing successfully for undergraduate and graduate degrees. You're creating an extremely competent and capable cadre of young women, many of whom don't have opportunities when they get out of school to use what they've learned successfully and creatively in advancing the economy. And so how is society going to come to grips with the reality of young women who want to be part of the marketplace and yet are unable because of social restrictions to fully compete successfully? Third, and related to all of that, you have the challenge of the religious establishment that is not prepared to cease its control over the critical components of social and cultural life in Saudi Arabia, and this goes again back to gender issues, but also more broadly. And finally, the growth of the Saudi royal family. And of course, one of the subcontexts of the Vision 2030, and several of you have touched on this, is the extent to which the Vision 2030 is a reflection of the will of Mohammed bin Salman and those members of the royal family who are associated with him or who support him. But the family has become increasingly large and unwieldy. It is factionalized in many instances. And to what extent will the society be able to continue in the government structure that it has now to hold the family together and to keep them working towards a single vision and a single idea of the future? So I throw that out and welcome any of your comments.
I guess I'll address your first question. So over the past few months, 3 opinion pieces that were published in the mainstream press here in the U.S. caught my attention. They were written by 3 very prominent Americans, Thomas Friedman, columnist for the New York Times, and former ambassadors Dennis Ross and Zalmay Khalilzad, who I'm sure everybody here knows as well. All 3 of them visited Saudi Arabia earlier this year, and the opinion pieces were basically a summation of their impressions of what they saw. And the common theme there is that they all were just absolutely astounded by the changes and then the tone of the discussions that they had, not just with high-ranking officials, but with regular Saudis from all walks of life. That has been my experience as well. And again, I think for casual observers who maybe haven't lived in Saudi Arabia, haven't visited much or lived in it much, there's this perception that Saudi Arabia is the land where time has stood still, that nothing ever changes. And I couldn't disagree more. I visit the kingdom fairly frequently. I was there in May to work on a report that looked into education reform. And again, in speaking to not just senior government officials, but in speaking to a wide swath of Saudi society, members of the Shura Council, journalists, businessmen, students, both men and women, there's a sense among almost everybody I spoke to that things were moving and moving in the right direction. What I've argued is, obviously, much attention has been focused on this national transformation plan and the economic component of it. But what I've argued in some of my recent writing is that if you look, there's been a slower, perhaps less noticeable transformation in the political culture of Saudi Arabia that has been ongoing since the early 1990s. And this vision, I think, in many ways is a culmination of this longer, slower process. At this point, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that almost all political, economic, and social institutions in Saudi Arabia, with very few exceptions, are undergoing review and reevaluation. I think this is why you get this Vision 2030 in the first place. And I think that what the vision calls on Saudi citizens to do is to reevaluate not just their role, but also in society, but also to modify their expectations, not necessarily to lower them, but just to come to grips with the reality of Saudi Arabia. It should no longer be compared to, there's a tendency, I think, again, for casual observers to compare to Saudi Arabia to other Gulf states, like Qatar, for instance, which has a significantly smaller population. Again, Saudi Arabia's population has grown significantly, and it has serious daunting economic challenges. However, I think you're beginning to see some of this change in expectation. And I'll cite just one example here, and maybe I see some Saudi colleagues, ex-colleagues and friends here who might get a kick of this example. So Saudi Arabia has a fried chicken franchise known as Al-Baik. For many years, it was strictly in my area in the Hijaz, where I'm from, in Jeddah. Recently, I think last year, it actually finally made the big move to Buraydah, which is in the center of Saudi Arabia. This thing is so big that there's been stories of people driving to Jeddah or to Mecca from other regions just to have this chicken and then bringing it back to some of their colleagues or families. Frankly, it's okay. I don't think it's that great, but who am I to judge? However, last year it finally opened in Buraydah, which is again in the heart of Saudi Arabia. Now, in addition, and this grand opening was covered in the mainstream press. Now, granted, again, it's quite a phenomenon, so there was almost a stampede of customers, and the police were called in, and I think they might have actually interrupted the opening. However, the same article, and I think much more interesting, had essentially the first class of not customers rather, but employees who were employed at this fast food joint. These were almost, I think, exclusively Saudis. Now, most people think Saudis working in a fast food establishment. That's not what you think of when traditionally you think of Saudi Arabia. You think maybe there were different expectations. That's no longer the case. I think many young Saudis have come to the realization that it is simply not realistic to expect to come out of college and to have the corner office in a bank in a managerial position, that it is okay and it's honorable to start working in something like a fast food joint. There were pictures of this class who were actually, the class they were dressed almost in what you get at graduating ceremonies. So you're beginning to see more and more of this. I think people have come to the realization that this is a big country. This is a country that has daunting economic expectations. But like I said, I think just about every institution is up for review. And I think some of the difficulties that some of my panelists here have already mentioned, I think this will be tackled. I mean, whether it's the National Transformation Program or rather the program itself is built on constant reevaluation and review. It is not meant to be a one-time off thing, but there is a constant and a regular, continuous evaluation of what works and what doesn't. I think the impression I get is that if something does not work, that it will be reevaluated, it will be scrapped. We've already seen at least one senior government official who essentially lost his position. That was the Minister of Water, because of the fact that the price of water was increased rather dramatically, suddenly, without putting the legwork in terms of preparing people for it. And Prince Mohammed bin Salman essentially admitted this in the Al Arabiya interview that I cited earlier. He said that, yes, that was not what we had in mind, and the minister did lose his position because of that. So I anticipate, like I said in my earlier remarks, I think people will, the plan is to hold people accountable, and if you don't perform, then there will be other solutions and other people who, in theory, can do a better job. So I think people are on senior officials, I think, are kind of on their heels, and frankly, I think this is just a kind of a new way and a very different way of doing things. That's the impression I have.
Yeah, but I just wanted to say that it is not basically the effect that people are looking for, to be holding accountable, certain officials which are bound to produce something. And this was something that I hinted on my speech, that you're creating an environment of high competitiveness between people with very limited resources and infrastructure, which really is doomed for failure, basically. So I don't think that what we're aiming for is to create this kind of competitiveness just to sacrifice a minister or so if something goes bad. My own impression is that there is some kind of resentment on many levels in Saudi Arabia, especially among youth. There is a resentment a lot among women, because basically none of the issues, there is an ongoing campaign online. It enters more than 100 days for the government to respond by doing something like removing some of the restrictions on women regarding the guardianship system, the driving, the other issues that are needed for people really to tap the potentials of people. So to say that we have challenges, it's not that these challenges are not unique, but they are not addressed. And this is one of the main challenge of having a vision which is top to down, that is not really feeding on the needs and aspirations of the people. We do not want a change in social contract, as a Saudi, of course, I'm speaking, that would bring more burden and more responsibilities on people without having, the environment, the enabling environment that would really help them to tackle the issues that they face. So having more women educated, it just adds to the frustration. Having more governments, bodies or entities tied up by so many restrictions, which are religious or not, stopping some of the few religious police from conducting some field work, while having religious mandates of preventing people from having, some kind of education, physical education, or some addressing the main issues in the health system, basically. So I feel like all the things that people are calling for are not really addressed, and these are not things which are difficult or incomparable to other nations. These are basic things that should be implemented in order to reach those kind of visions or those kind of, and if it's not implemented now, then when? Basically, this is the thing. You need it now because there is no other resources for people to turn to, unless you want to empower the tribes or to empower, recruitment to more extremists. This is very serious, in my opinion.
I'd just like to comment on the absolutely superb presentation by Tony Kordsman. I think one of the questions Tony asked is, how did this come about? I think one of the many interviews which Prince Mohammed bin Salman gave mentioned that in the Ministry of Defense, we're missing, quote unquote, $200 billion that disappeared. I think what they're trying to do by spending 50% of the military expenses within Saudi Arabia is to really stop the corruption. And the royal family has already been kicked out of the military power quite substantially. And the procurements have been given basically to commoners. So many things have changed. Now, it is absolutely true that building an F-15 in Saudi Arabia is complete nonsense. So that I would totally agree. There are many other expenses that maybe could be done in Saudi Arabia. I don't think that actually what is going to be done by this big major company that will be floated on the stock exchange is perhaps very vague, but it's not coming from nowhere. I think the key of Mohammed bin Salman here, who is Minister of Defense, by the way, is that he wants to really change the whole approach of the royal family. The royal family makes money from the oil because they get a little percentage from the top, and they get money from their investments or their involvement in military contracts. And both of these things are being changed and taken away from them. Mohammed bin Salman is trying to change the royal family for the good of the royal family, because they're afraid that if they don't do that, then the royal family will get somewhat kicked out somewhere along the line. So they have to come up to standards where they're like everybody else, like citizens like everybody else, and not above the law. So I don't know whether, and I agree with Tony that the dream of doing 50% is really very, very difficult, but it's not coming out of nowhere.
Well,
And so that's really what I
let me just say, if I may, that if you do not have transparency, if you do not have accountability, if both are not public, I have dealt with too many countries and seen too much corruption and waste and too little management. You cannot put optimism as a substitute for experience. And quite frankly, coming out of nowhere, a lot of this did come out of nowhere, because if you read the detailed calendar for the implementation plan, it's very clear that somebody had to rush out and write that stuff and set arbitrary goals. If you have a credible plan for dealing with defense industries and a credible proposal, it exists on paper, it is a business plan, and it exists in detail. If you don't have that, you don't have a start or a plan. And I don't think we are going to do the Saudis any favor, or any developing country any favor, by repeating the kind of optimism about development that we have used in far too many countries, including Afghanistan and Iraq. It is a form of American irresponsibility, and it exists just as much in a democratic society as you can be irresponsible in a monarchy.
We want to give people in the audience an opportunity to ask their questions. I will reserve for myself the right for the last word in this conversation, and that is Saudi Arabia for many, many years pursued a policy of overbuild, overbuy with the United States, providing the vast majority of defense goods and services. It worked rather well in 1991 when the U.S. military was able to deploy to Saudi Arabia very quickly to defend the kingdom and more broadly the GCC because the Saudis had built bases, utilized equipment that was all consistent with our own military engagement. If you go to this 50% mechanism, the assumption will be that there will be a bidding competition where it's not only the U.S. defense manufacturers, but many others who will be participating in this. And what you're going to end up with is a mishmash of defense equipment. And anyone who believes that the next time there's a call for an emergency that the Chinese are going to come sailing into Saudi Arabia to defend the Saudis, I think misjudges what the reality is of global security architecture. But with that, let me just ask, we have 2 microphones, and if you would just wait to be acknowledged, and we will produce a microphone over here, and try to give people opportunities.
Thank you very much, Alexander Kravitz from Insight Iraq. This has been a fascinating panel. I kind of felt that the vision rose at the beginning, then was slowed down when it met the reality of Ms. Al-Dosari, and then sort of crashed against, Tony Cordesman's presentation. But, when you talk about a restructured social contract, almost by definition, a social contract has 2 parties to it, right? In here, I think we have been hearing about the responsibilities of the state, one party to the contract. But I want to pick up on what Ms. Al-Dosari was saying, about the resentment among women and youth. I couldn't help wondering is this, an attempt to have a sort of a controlled Arab Spring, or I was remembering from my graduate school days, not here at SAIS, but there was perestroika with glasnost. And to be a little provocative, I'm wondering if, could this be a case of perestroika without glasnost? And we all kind of know how perestroika with glasnost ended. Thank you.
Well, thank you for your question. I think one of the things that again, when I speak about a kind of a transformation in Saudi Arabia's political culture over a few decades at this point, is that what I've observed is that the political space available to Saudis has increased over time. And I think that is the expectation going forward, that it will continue to increase. The ambassador to the United States, Prince Abdullah Al Saud, penned, again, another reference to an opinion piece, but I think it's relevant in this case, an opinion piece in USA Today, where he not only spoke, or rather wrote about the Vision 2030 and the economic reforms, but there's an entire paragraph where he talks about upcoming political reforms, and some of the reforms that have already been implemented, and some that are upcoming and that will continue. So when I speak about some of these institutions, again, looking at a broader time frame, I'm talking about the Shura Council in Saudi Arabia, which is a consultative body. Now, I think even within Saudi Arabia, the Shura Council, I think, still has an unfavorable impression among Saudis. But I think it's somewhat unfair. I think if you look at it, one, its membership has increased. Initially in 1992, when it was constituted, it had 60 members. It's 150 members now, including 30 women. It represents every region in the country. It represents, there are at least 7 or 8 minority Shia members. And even though as a legislative body, I think it needs a lot more legislative teeth, as the saying goes, but I think it's become a much more serious deliberative body. So in years past, some of the issues that were simply, in essence, taboo to discuss publicly are now discussed on a daily basis in Saudi Arabia. And obviously, you've had elections where, again, women participated for the first time. Last year, you've had an actual national dialogue process. I actually visited the headquarters of the King Abdulaziz Center for National Dialogue when I was in Riyadh in May. And I think they do great work to encourage a culture of dialogue between Saudis and the outside world. Sure. So I think there's a lot going on. But what happens day to day, I think, gets missed sometimes, especially when you're 8,000 miles away, I think.
Okay, great. So we'll try to take a few questions and give the panelists an opportunity to respond, please.
Middle East Institute. My question is primarily addressed to Halal Dosari. It has long seemed to me that Saudi Arabia could address some of the social issues you talked about and encourage and provide more employment for women by encouraging rather than prohibiting the development of vigorous NGOs.
Yeah.
What is the status of the NGO law?
Okay.
Yeah. Well,
Let's take a couple of others from, why don't we go in the back?
Thank you for the chance to ask. I'm Jiang from Georgetown University. I have a question for Mr. Nasir. Saudi Arabia is carrying out the restructuring program, but it is under the economic hardship because of the falling oil prices. Last year the deficit it was around $19 billion. So what's your, how do you think of the projects of the restructuring plan? Are you optimistic or pessimistic about this plan? Thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you. Let's take one more from this side. In the back over here. Gentleman in the blue jacket.
I'm Patrick
or
Theros.
even in the mic, Pat.
I'm Patrick Theros. I run the U.S. Qatar Business Council. Everybody that I've been speaking to so far, including this council's very interesting seminar, seems to be whistling past the graveyard on Jasta. So if you could address that a bit.
Okay. Okay, so why don't we go ahead and try to tackle those questions?
So Saudi Arabia do not allow civil society organizations in general, but there has been a law that was released last year to basically regulate the functions of the civil societies. Mainly, there will be an sanction of whatever is existed, basically looking into the charity functions of the civil society, but not the independent assembly or provision of women's rights or health rights, human rights and things of more of a political and civil rights nature, but more into the charity. I've written actually on that on the website of the Arab Gulf States Institute. So the civil society allows the Minister of Social Affairs and the Minister of Islamic Affairs the authority to dismantle any organization, to withhold any, without even having to go to court if he feels like they are not functioning as according to the regulations. So it's still restricted. The third sector is very much regulated and restricted in Saudi Arabia. And it goes back to the limit of expectations from the people as agents in such a political system. So basically, there is not going to be a lot going on with civil society, though the government is really looking into the civil society as means to supplement the reduction in government spending. Most of the people who are on the welfare system, a good deal of the people are women. So there is an encouragement for the charity aspects of the civil society, basically to provide more of a rehabilitation, basically building capacity of people to seek more work opportunities, but not necessarily challenging the social norms or advocating for more political or civil change in policies.
Great, thank you.
I did mention JASTA, but let me just comment on some aspects of it. One problem we have is the 28 pages were released still semi-redacted, totally out of context, without even an explanation of the report they came from, which many people confused with the 9/11 Commission report. It was not from that. It was actually a congressional staff report made in December 2002, with very little real time to actually make an assessment or look at the evidence. When the administration actually commented on it, it issued papers out of the White House which were all legalistic. All they really dealt with was the risk of somebody suing the United States. There was no comment whatsoever on the content of the 28 pages, whether they were valid, any of the evidence that had existed between 2002 and the present. That happened in spite of the fact the FBI had already done a report more than a decade later, which basically debunked virtually all of the charges in the 28 pages. I have no idea why the White House chose that approach, but I have seen the White House do some very strange things over the years. The difficulty is it left no one with any context whatsoever to evaluate the 28 pages in. To the extent there is a context, again, since 2004, we've had a series of annual reports from the State Department on terrorism. Each of them has noted that Saudi Arabia is a critical partner in counterterrorism. Where we once only had advisory missions to the Saudi Army and the National Guard, we now have a major training, advisory, and assistance mission to the Ministry of Interior, which is actually showing up as a significant arms purchaser for the first time. In the course of that period, we have seen serious problems with private donations from a number of countries. The major source of funding that has gone to extremist and terrorist groups is not the country of Saudi Arabia. And I think if we are going to look at the issue of outside support of terrorist groups, it would be a very good idea to focus on all of the countries which are potential or real donors to extremist groups. It would certainly help put the Saudi experience into context. Now, I hardly need say that that report or the legislation of JASTA sailed by because it was an election year. It was a marvelous opportunity to sort of score points in terms of counterterrorism. It didn't really matter whether any of the families ever got any benefits. It's probably going to be a minimum of 2 years before you even get a clear legislative precedent, if you can go that far. There was a certain sobering up period on the part of some members of the Congress, but if you wanted to hand the next administration and Saudi-U.S. relations a really miserable problem, this was a marvelous example not only of bipartisanship within the Congress, but equal policy competence between the White House and Capitol Hill. It may be the only such case in the last 4 years.
Just a quick point on this. My worry about JASTA was, from an old banker standpoint speaking here, is that any good lawyer in New York who is going to take that case, the first thing they will do is try to block the accounts of Saudi Arabia. Now, that is not, the consequences are not huge because the money, the dollars, can be transferred under Eurodollar in London, and then it's not subject to the judges in the US. But it's going to very much make a lot of investors in the United States think twice about putting money in the US.
Well, I'll tell you what, we have one last question on the table. Why don't we, and it's an appropriate question to end on, which is for Fahad, and whether you are, given the current state of the oil economy, whether you are still optimistic about the potential for Vision 2030.
Right. So obviously, the Saudi government was well aware of the budget deficit last year, and it was the biggest on record. This year's budget deficit will also be very large, but I think it will be smaller than last year. The government has taken some measures to cut its spending. So it's cut its subsidies to oil, electricity, and water. And as I mentioned earlier, there was a bit of a pushback from consumers regarding the price of water because there was kind of a sudden, almost drastic increase in the price of water, and we saw some Saudis express their displeasure at that. At the same time, I think overall, I mean, ultimately, like I said, in preparing for this panel, I went back and read the Vision 2030 very carefully. I read the National Transformation Program very carefully. I am hopeful, I think, overall, because I got the sense that they've given, overall, I think they've given these challenges quite a bit of thought. I mean, the IMF, among other institutions, welcomed this, the vision and some of the measures and provisions that it's called for. Much of the report does sound and seems very familiar, and it hits on these themes. But again, I think Saudi planners and the Saudi public in general, like Jean-Francois, I think, mentioned this earlier, many of these provisions and reforms are not new. They've been talked about for many years. But I think you do have a new leadership that has decided that the current model is simply not sustainable, and that it was time to actually push these reforms forward because of the structural changes to the global oil market. So I am hopeful overall, again, based on my visits to the kingdom and speaking to various people. I think there's going to be a trial and error process. I don't think anyone expects this to work wonders in the next year or two or maybe 5. I think that there is certainly room for evaluation and changes, and I'm sure there will be things that will not work, and I think that the vision makes that very clear. Not everything has worked in the past, and I suspect that not everything will work in the future. I think that's only normal. Now the question is, do you learn from past mistakes and keep moving forward, or do you just basically kind of say, well, there's really not much we can do, and where does that take you is ultimately the question.
Thank you. Let me thank our panelists, Fahad Nazar, Dr. Jean-Francois Sesnek, Hala Dosari, and Anthony Cordesman, for, I hope, a very thought-provoking and stimulating conversation on Vision 2030. Thank you again for all of you who came and joined us, and as Paul said, we will hopefully see you again in the future. Thank you.